Joy Ude is a mixed media artist and designer, an American-born child of Nigerian immigrants. Ude explores the concept of duality in her artwork. Ude earned her B.F.A. in fashion design in 2005 from University of North Texas. After working in the fashion industry, she returned and earned an MFA in fiber arts from the University of North Texas in 2013.
Dramatic pause.
Dramatic pause. Her work has been included in several regional and national shows, including Craft Texas, Fantastic Fibers, Fiber Art International, and Art Scene. Ude teaches fiber-based workshops, most recently at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. Ude is currently Director of Education.
Fancy.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Director of Education
recently.
at Tufts of the World and a member of Fjord Gallery in Philadelphia. So please join me in welcoming Joy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming to this short little roundabout talk. And also, it's been wonderful catching up with people that I've missed, people that have meant a lot. Actually, in my career, as I continue, Anna told me, I'm just going to keep sharing this with people because it's very funny to me, that I hold the record for most requested recommendations from her. So it's nice to reconnect with people that were really helpful in forming sort of like how I was thinking about what to do beyond grad school and continue to support me after. It's really nice to be back. So thank you for having me. The talk is going to be super informal. It really is, just especially because it's being recorded, and I'm hoping that it will help. You know, I talked to some students today. I'll be talking to more tomorrow, but just really sort of emphasizing that that's not really a linear path that I took, and that I, in trying to find opportunities, was also trying to make sure that I was getting plugged into communities around me to expand those opportunities, and also to sort of provide opportunities for others as I was meeting them. So first off, starting right outside of grad school, talking to some of the students that I did today, I thought, wow, you are very self-possessed, and already into your sophomore year, you already know what you want to do. Even coming back to grad school, because I had worked as a designer, and that was like 4 years of my life, I did not know what I was going to do after grad school. I knew that I didn't want to return to fashion. I didn't know that I wanted to work in any sort of corporate setting, and I knew that if I did want to teach, which was important to me, I didn't really want to be teaching at a university. I knew the things I didn't want, but I didn't know what I did want. And so it was basically me just asking a lot of questions. Was I willing to move? Yes, I was willing to move. I'd done that after undergrad. I had no issue with that. Did I need to have a paying job? Yes, hopefully, because moving away from Texas after being a design assistant for a very short period of time at JCPenney, I did an unpaid internship with Betsy Johnson, which meant that I also had to work a part-time job. So I was sleeping maybe 3 hours a night when I was doing that, and I thought, I don't want to do that again. So yes, I need something that will pay me, or at a minimum provide some sort of benefit, lodging, a stipend, something. And so I started to think about questions in the environment that I wanted to be in. If it wasn't formal, what did I want out of it? I wanted to be able to keep teaching, and that was something that was really important to me. So I started looking for residencies that would allow me to teach, that I would have time to make work, that if I had to get some sort of work, I would also be able to do that. And I ended up at this very small art center in Lincoln, Nebraska called Lux Center for the Arts. And so the images that you're seeing now are some of the students, the minors, the younger kids, the youth that I got to work with, teaching them how to screen print, teaching them how to make a screen from nothing, stretch their mesh, use the resist techniques. And this was just one sort of class that I was teaching there. I was teaching embroidery, I was helping with summer camp, I was working in clay even though that wasn't my area. I was working in a lot of different areas, but some unique things that came out of that, and knowing that I would be working with this age group the most, I got to work with more adults, so that helped me to work beyond just college age adults, but like older adults. I taught someone that was 80 how to screen print and how to make their own frame. That's not something I could have anticipated or even knew that I was interested in, working in this wide age range. And it extended beyond that to doing sort of after school programming. It extended to actually working with youth at a local detention center because it was the only sort of art that they got to work on. Most of what was happening is that a lot of preachers were going into the youth detention center and trying to force them to do Bible studies and stuff. So they would tell me frequently, I could not take pencils into them, I couldn't take anything sharp, but we did foam prints. I figured out creative ways that they got to do printmaking techniques or screen printing, and they told me that it meant a lot, that someone was not trying to convince them to do a thing, and was just allowing them to express themselves in a way that was important to them, because it felt like no one else was listening to them. And I also got to work with cancer survivors at the local regional hospital there. So out of what I really did want to do in working with younger kids and teaching them techniques younger, because I think it's important for them to learn certain things younger. A lot of them don't get to learn embroidery until a certain age, which was a surprise to me because I learned crochet and embroidery when I was 8. And I just thought everyone's doing this, but not everyone is doing this. So all these assumptions that I had to sort of forget, and then I had to think about how can I make this accessible to this certain age range, and in situations where we don't have supplies or where I'm having to transport artwork from where someone's working back to our art center, how am I sort of approaching those either concerns or those unique situations? So that was a really good, nearly 2-year experience that I had there. While I was there, I was also working on a show that was very different from my thesis show here. That show mainly was concentrated on sort of how Black Americans have been depicted historically in American culture. So I was doing a lot of intense research on caricatures and all of these really sort of, a lot of upsetting imagery, but a lot of things that I was thinking about having grown up in a family where my parents immigrated here when they were adults and knew nothing of racism until they came to this country. It was really important for me as a kid that had experienced some of that, and they were confused by it, and I didn't feel like I could talk to them to understand what that meant. Leaving here and trying to sort of, and my mom many times would ask, when are you going to stop making sad work? Like, she did not understand really what the topic was about or why I was dwelling on it. It was hard for her to understand. And I thought that it would be an interesting turn to then talk more about family and culture loss and the things that I missed by growing up here and not getting to visit my family in Nigeria as much as I would have liked to. So I basically did a 180, started focusing more on family, on, you know, things that visually I had grown up with, but didn't have a deep understanding of, trying to understand my parents' experience more, my extended family's experience more. And out of that came a body of work where I was talking about sort of this disconnect, having seen my grandfather only once before he passed away, and I was really young when that happened. I still remembered his face. Like, his face is very clear in my mind. It has been since I saw him. And so using images of him and of my grandmother, who passed away only just a couple of years ago. She lived to be over 100. But sort of thinking about what it meant to be surrounded by this fabric that is really, you know, sort of embedded in our culture, the textures that go along with it, but then also what it means to see that in a very Americanized way, which is where the dresses come in. You would never see kids' clothes made in a regular little toddler smock. My cousin, Margaret, is sitting here laughing because we were made to dress up in much traditional wear, and you never would have worn a dress like this. But sort of embroidered across each of these dresses, depending on what it goes with, I had 4 wall hangings of my grandfather's face and 4 of my grandmother's. And the dresses that went along were repeating in different, Igbo is the language that my parents speak. Different ways to say grandmother or grandfather in Igbo. So the wall hanging in bright, vivid color would be hung across from this sort of faded, purposely distressed dress that had grandmother or grandfather written over and over again across. Coming off of the residency that I was at in Nebraska, being in Nebraska was its own interesting experience, but I needed to not be there. A lot was happening, especially a lot politically, and I was like, I need to leave this place. And so even though I'd been asked to stay for a full 2 years, after about a year and a half, I started thinking about the next thing that I wanted to do. Still interested in teaching, but I also wanted to be making more work, and I wanted to focus on yardage printing and also improve my techniques in that, like work larger scale. In school, we were working at a small scale. It was what available, but I knew that there was this program, the Fabric Workshop and Museum Apprenticeship, and so I sort of built out the portfolio of things I'd been working on, things that I'd been teaching, because I knew that there were opportunities to work in their educational program too, as part of that apprenticeship. And I applied and was accepted. So I moved in 2015 to Philadelphia to take part of that apprenticeship. And these are just some images of sort of my ideation as I was trying to figure out my repeat print that I was gonna make. As a post-grad apprentice, because they have post-grad and high school programs, the high schoolers get to make a one-color print that they get to make. I think they keep 4 yards and then they give 4 yards to the museum. The museum has like a record of all the different prints that every apprentice that has come through there has made. But the post-grads got to make a 1-color and a 3-color. So this design was my 3-color. I still was thinking about family. I still was thinking about the textures and the pattern involved in those Dutch wax cloth prints that are so like unique to our culture and our clothing. So I created a batik sample of mine. And then going back to my sort of background in working in Illustrator and in Photoshop for fashion design, I scanned it in, I played around with inverting color, I played around with making it sort of a puzzle and creating a new pattern, like a new sort of blended pattern where, you know, this batik one originally existed. Out of that, I came up with 4 different colorways. This green and purple one was a test, but the top, I think, left to everyone sitting with the coral and the lavender and the turquoise. That was the final print that I ended up with on a natural color cotton cloth. There was the proof print one. The second proof print, which was this really bright coloring, was not done in regular pigment, but was a dye screen print, because I was interested in testing what happened with bleeding versus with a really sharp edge, which is what the top one has. And so being at this apprenticeship allowed me to experiment a little bit more. It allowed me studio space to work in. It allowed me to also see how other people were working and considering their prints. Some people were working much more figuratively. Some people were even more abstract than what I was working in. But it was great to be back in a place, much like grad school, where you were surrounded with people interested in the same thing that you are, but working in so many different ways, and you're getting to see how that process plays out. And we were expected not only to create our print, but because it's so large scale, you have to print across from a second person. So we're also learning how to work collaboratively. So you're passing back and forth. That person is trusting you to, you know, maintain the pressure on the screen so that their print is coming out nicely all the way down the table. So you're working in unison, but you're also getting to be really unique in the way that you're designing your own work. While I was still there, I was also doing what was called a fob holder program at Second State Press, which is a local printing press and studio there. Someone that had worked at Fabric Workshop started this sort of program where you could go and you would be able to have unlimited access to the studio, and you were just sort of working and helping out there about 12 hours a week. You were sitting and either helping with classes, you were sitting during the operating time so that people could come in and they could pay for open studio time. So it was an exchange of time, just like the apprenticeship was. With the apprenticeship, if you were full-time, you were expected to be there 3 days a week. And then the rest of the days you could either be working there or you could be going around the city and figuring out what you wanted to do. But finding these sort of, because I did not go to school in Philadelphia, and literally every other person I met there either had connections there or had gone to school there, I really was having to find these different opportunities so I could build a community and figure out what other opportunities there were beyond that. Something that really helped is that I got hired to work at the Fabric Workshop in their studio team after the apprenticeship. I was there during a time when they were doing an artist in residency project for a Biennale. I made myself invaluable to them by sewing and by helping in other ways because I had experience and I'd worked with youth. I was also able to help the high school apprentices. So for me, every opportunity that I've had has come out of looking and assessing and observing and then trying to react to that, trying to be sensitive to what's happening, but also trying to say, how can I become plugged in so that I can help, but also so that I can have these opportunities. So this sort of series where I created netting and then embossed it into this paper, I don't even know if you can tell what the patterns are on there. I've been told that when I present that, it's really hard to see. But each one of these papers has a net that has been pressed into the paper from underneath. So again, it was another opportunity to work with people that were experimenting because they were in a space where they had the time to. I'd never worked on a print press before for any long period of time. We have print here and I got to do some of the workshops where they brought visiting artists, but I had a whole year where I was just experimenting with impressing these textures, using color with it sometimes, using water with it sometimes. And so again, it was just a way to work in a familiar media, but then bring in something else and experiment with what the end product looked like. So going back to my time working at Fabric Workshop, a lot of artists come through there, a lot of artist projects are happening all at one time. You are having to try and figure out as a studio member where your strength lies. So obviously a background in textiles, you're helping direct interns with the embroidery process. For instance, on Cynthia Hopkins, The Truth, a Tragedy large panel that we had to cut out all these little felt letters and then basically tack them to this large curtain or embroider directly onto the curtain these shapes of knots to try and bring her vision to life. That was the very first artist in residence project I worked on as a studio member. To the right, you have these large curtains made of Tyvek that we table painted on the print tables for Ann Hamilton's show, this very short-term show that she did at Cherry Street Pier that's in Philadelphia. And so not only because we know how to construct, all three of us, Paige, Andrea that's in the front there, all three of us have sewing experience. So we were tasked not only with sewing, but because I was on the print team and one of the lead printers, I also had to help figure out how we were going to table paint all of this Tyvek with paint. We experimented, we figured out that we had to wash it, otherwise the color didn't spread evenly. A lot of what we did there was bringing the skills that we had, but experimenting with how to make people happy. And was really unhappy with our first iteration. There was too much color. So we had to wash things out and we had to figure out how are we making this a streamlined production process. It is an artist in resident project, but we have to work in a production way because when we are working on artist in residence projects, we are also still printing yardage for these shops. So it was a lot of problem solving, but problem solving in a way that really played to the experience of all the people on the team. Painters, fiber artists, people that fabricated in metal. We all just had to figure out how to work cooperatively. The jacket that you see here on the bottom is an Ursula von Riddingsvard piece that we worked where we took apart a whole bunch of existing jackets and made them one huge Franken jacket. And the only reason that it looks like a body is in there is because my coworker Paige and I had to figure out how to make a frame out of chicken wire. We got cut so much by making that project, but again, all of us really enjoyed being there and having these experiences because every single project was different and you could not predict what would happen. These sort of egg-looking forms are inspired by Brancusi that the artist Lenka Clayton was really obsessed with. That's at the PMA. The face that is turned to the side, made of stone. And she had envisioned having people that had low or no vision feeling this form and creating their own version of it. So we actually took these forms that we sort of vacuum sealed out of concrete and we took them to a school for people that had low to no vision, and they created their own version by shaving these forms down. And then we displayed them similarly to how you would see it at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So, I mean, there were just so many invaluable experiences that I had working at the Fabric Workshop. This is the production printing that I was talking about. So in both of these pictures, I'm working across from my coworker, Kate. And it was just different day to day, and it really satisfied an itch and a curiosity I had in seeing not only how other artists work, but seeing how you would have to work when you were also trying to make things that had to be for sale. We had to figure out our budgets for yardage because technically we weren't paying ourselves for making this, but it had to go in the shop and it had to be for sale. So I was learning all of these things again. I could not have anticipated about budgeting, about expensing, about making sure the safety data sheets were up to date. Things that when people come in, because people could tour and walk as we were printing, all they saw was the art making, but then you're learning about all the admin behind it as well. So that was just really something that you couldn't have planned for, something I could not have anticipated, and something that I really valued being there for the 3 years that I was there. Also, I was there because I guess I just don't ever need to sleep. I was teaching at Tyler School of Art, and so I taught undergrads there for a year an intro to fiber survey. I was teaching them shibori, I was teaching them embroidery, stamping, basketry, macrame, which they really loved. I call that a grandma art, but they loved it. And so I was happy that they did love it. And most importantly, sewing. I was seeing, and because of the time period, it was 2016, a lot of things were happening. There were anxieties that were starting to crop up in our students that I was noticing. And it really made me think about confidence level in students at that age. And already at that time, I was thinking, I really wish there was a way for me to work with younger students, which will come up as I continue talking. But they would come into the classroom, and with many things, they might be fine, they might be interested, but sewing always scared so many of them. They thought they would sew their fingers, which I was like, unless you're shoving your fingers under the needle, I don't know how you think that's going to happen. The foot will not allow your finger. You just were encouraging them, but also recognizing that there were all these fears that were probably coming from more than what was in the classroom. So it was really interesting to work semester to semester with students that had some experience in some of these techniques versus no experience in these techniques, and see by the end of the semester what came out of it. This really one of my favorite ever art pieces with all of these different types of meat is based on a project that I gave them called Flat, Filled, Full, where they had to make 3 versions of a similar item. I did not have any restrictions on what that item was, but they had to interpret this object being completely flat, so sewn and just turned inside out, not filled at all, slightly full, so just a small sort of scale of sculptural object, and then a fully sculptural object, all out of fabric. And that was actually inspired by something that we did here at UNT in the Core 2 design program, where they were learning how to make these soft sculpture things, and I thought, you cannot just force someone to make a full sculpture. Their brain doesn't think that way if they're not, especially if they're not in a fashion program, right? We learn pattern making in that program, so it starts to make sense to us how we can work dimensionally, but if you have no experience, you have to step them up. And so I thought, start with a flat thing, tell them that a flat thing just needs short little walls for the second item, and then get them to experiment and think about how to make a full sculptural thing. I ended up getting pineapples, I got Warhol's Campbell's soup can, I got candles that had melted down. It was really beautiful to see how each student interpreted it differently, but it was also a way to back in and show them, like, you do not have to know the hardest thing immediately. Give yourself some time to get used to working in this way, and then just gradually step it up until you get more comfortable. While I was at Tyler, I was also noticing the makeup of the student body, which is relevant to me being here today, and seeing that we did not have a lot of students of color. I think across a whole year, I had 2 Korean students and 1 Hispanic student. And I was really confused and surprised because Temple is surrounded by historically Black neighborhoods. And I was like, none of these students are here. And it was important to me that even if it was not happening directly in my classroom, that there was some sort of programming that would interest students, or at least speak to them and their experiences at the university. So I reached out to, after seeing at the Black Star Film Festival, I reached out to this sort of artist and speaker, Chantrell Lewis, who's pictured there at the bottom with her book, because I'd gotten her book and it was talking about dandyism and all these patterns in menswear and culture and how it plays into masculinity. And I thought it would be great to have a panel discussion about Black masculinity and clothing and sartorial just interests. So I asked her to come speak. I asked Devin Morris, who I'd worked with in another way, this young artist who's on the opposite side of the card, to come speak, because a lot of his work was talking about the Black male experience, but also his identity as a queer artist. And then Wale in the middle had worked on some projects, most notably for Black Panther. There's a scarf at the very end of the first movie, which if you've seen it, that's actually his work. And I thought it would be interesting from all these people interested in fashion, interested in design, interested in art, but in completely different backgrounds, to have a conversation and just have the students hear how people come to find each other, but also how they interact with each other, whether that's considering each other's work, being inspired by each other's work, because Chantrell and Wale knew each other, or just getting to know a new area of design and fashion and then responding to it in real time. So that was a really great conversation that we got to have that evening. And it sort of started a process along with my coworker Paige from the Fabric Workshop. She also started a fashion show that would happen every year, because Tyler does not have a fashion program. And we thought, you know, in order to get these students in here that you're interested in speaking to, you have to provide some sort of programming outside of the school, outside of the classroom rather. And so we tried to start of, you know, having experience at Fabric Workshop, think about lecture series or guest speakers or things that people would come to Fabric Workshop for, and how we could bring that into Tyler, and, you know, not necessarily in the classroom, because he always had speakers visiting in the classroom, but at least onto the campus that would get students interested. At the same time I was teaching and working at Fabric Workshop, I was also trying to still maintain my own studio practice, but respond again to that sort of anxiousness and sort of confusion and feelings that people had around, you know, this time, 2016, 2017. And so a collaborator of mine, Petra Floyd, and I created this space in the Colored Girls Museum, which is a museum owned by this really wonderful and interesting person named Vashti Dubois. We wanted to create sort of this safe space, enclosed, where people could come in, and people that identified as Black women could come in and write down sort of their anxieties or their hopes or their fears, and we would suspend them from the ceiling, and then they could have this space below where they could sit and reflect, or they could communicate, they could have community, there were books in the room, and it was really just sort of a quiet, reflective place that people could be in. As part of this process, I taught Petra, who is actually more a mixed media artist, how to coil the bowls that the people are sitting in. I'll go back because it's something that I'd used actually in some of my own grad work. And it was also about, you know, much like the G's Bend quilters, where they would have that community in quilting bees and sit and talk and commune while they were making. I taught her over the process of weeks how to do that, and that was another part that came into the project, and we wanted to share that sort of with the greater community in Philadelphia. So this is actually at Lucian Blackwell Free Library location in West Philadelphia, and we opened up this small coiled bowl workshop to participants of all ages. So we had kids as young as 8 come with their parents, all the way up into, again, the 80s, and people, once we showed them the basics, just started helping each other, which was a really important part of it, is that we just wanted to bring people together from all different walks of life that maybe would never have met, and have them sit and talk to each other and learn at the same time, and just have a conversation. Because again, especially in that setting and even in the show, building community was really important to both of us. Outside of working, I'm really looking at these pictures now. I realize that I think I'm never sitting still. At the same time that I was working at Fabric Workshop, I had not transitioned to my next job yet, but I was starting to meet more people as I was doing things like having shows at the Colored Girls Museum or working at Tyler. And I started to be invited to teach at places like the Please Touch Museum, which was for younger kids, which, again, because I am interested in working with young kids and teaching them things maybe they wouldn't learn at a young age, sewing, weaving, all that kind of stuff. It was exciting to have those opportunities. So here I'm working with some young kids on building out felted freedom quilts as part of the Juneteenth Festival at the Please Touch Museum. And then to the right, I'm teaching kids at a summer camp for the University City Arts League how to do monoprinting. So they would come up with their design, we would cut down the contact paper, and then they would learn the actual process for screen printing. Different from doing something like finger painting or, you know, those general techniques that really young kids learn. They're important to learn because any sort of tactile experience where they're developing motor skills is important. But I also think it's fun to try where you can to challenge them at a younger age and see what can you do, what are you capable of doing, because the response is usually beyond what most, you know, instructors or even like parents could imagine that they can do. So I'm always trying to think of like how young can I go in teaching, you know, students or participants certain techniques, and most of the time I'm either blown away or just really excited to see what they come up with. So tied into all of this, thinking about what I wanted to be doing, if it still made sense to be at the fabric workshop, because I really was missing teaching on a regular basis. I applied and was hired to work out of the makerspace at the Independent Seaport Museum. They had a grant-funded position that opened up. I was ready to move on to working with a younger group of students, and I said I have the technical skill to do that, in large part because I took James's digital fabrication class when I was here at UNT. So I understood how to work on a 3D printer, and I understood how to use a CNC router. So again, calling back to experiences that I already had, like it helped me to say I do have the skill set, I am capable of doing this, and I can help a younger audience because I've worked with kids so much, learn how to use it, appreciate it, and feel confident in using it. So here we have some kids that are weaving on these 3D printed looms, which is a lot of fun. They got little needles and they got combs that they could learn how to weave. Kids are the best weavers. They're better than adults, I think, because they don't care and they're not scared and they just go for it and they don't care what it looks like. And some of them just learned how to weave within the little loom and be like, I'm making a picture and then I'm gonna make all the yarn go around it. And I was like, great. I didn't learn that until my second semester weaving, so good for you. And then, you know, just learning how to use the actual technology part of it, and then learning how to fabricate and build once all those parts were built out. That was a lot of what I was doing. Teaching kids how to use SketchUp, and those were kids in the age range of 6th to 8th grade. Just really trying to take a technology focus and figure out how then to articulate that so that kids understood it, they weren't scared to try it, and they could just really go beyond their imagination of what they thought they could do. In addition to running the makerspace, both for mostly youth, but also for some adult programming, I was running the first year of a STEM program for young girls that were in high school in the Philadelphia area called Eagle, and that was run in conjunction with the Navy's it's called the NAFSA program. So they are interested in getting young women into STEM fields, or at least interested in it at a young age. The first year of that program involves these women making and operating underwater ROV. And so a lot of these girls were coming to me never having used power tools, definitely not having soldered before, and I was teaching all of these things to them in a short period of time, and also having them prepare this pitch like they were a company to sell this ROV to this panel of judges out of Temple University. They had to come up with a pamphlet, they had to make sure that the ROV was operational, sometimes more successful than others, but always like a good learning process. And they would have to do simple tasks like pick up a sort of hook from under the ground. They would have to dive very deep and then be able to navigate their way back up without sort of capsizing or falling back to the bottom of the pool. So again, having to work collaboratively, but also having to learn a new skill set, and then basically co-teaching each other as they were learning all of these different things. Involved in teaching and all this, I was still trying to make sure that I was leaving room for my own practice, which James mentioned that I'm a member of Fjord Gallery. That extended to me beyond just being in the studio, but also starting to work more curatorially. I didn't have as much experience with that, and working with other members of Fjord, there's about 7 of us right now, gave me the opportunity to see how people were doing that, see how they were reaching out to people, and then turning around on top of that, we're sort of promoting, publicizing these events, getting artist talks going. It really was a practice and an experience in getting comfortable with communicating an artist Working at the Lux Center for the Arts, I was also working in their gallery, so I already had to communicate with artists to be like, can you please get your work to me? How should this be installed? You didn't send any fixtures, what are we supposed to do? So it was all of this, but also having more ownership in what was coming into the gallery. And again, because it was important to me, being in a historically heavily minority area and not seeing that artwork represented in galleries, I was trying to take opportunities to extend to artists both in the Philly area, but also like, you know, across the country, and reaching out and saying, can you be part of this? Are you interested in being part of this? So Devin, who was part of the talk that I mentioned earlier, was one of the artists. And then I asked him to pick 2 people that he was interested in being shown with. And we would go through and the body of work and decide what pieces would be involved. Basil Kincaid is now like in the Smithsonian. At the time, he had not sold any of his work to them, but it was just interesting to be seeing these people as emerging artists, because that's who we're interested in sort of giving opportunities to, and emerging and mid-level artists. And then seeing how they have continued to grow or what they are working on beyond all of this. Devin also recently, I think, was granted a prize by Studio Museum in Harlem. So just seeing what comes out of people's careers after you have engaged with them is really fascinating. It's also really encouraging and really wonderful to see. And again, this is as a member of Fjord. We had new member shows. Whenever a large number of new members come in, we turn over and have like shows so that their work can also be seen. On the whole, we don't show our own work. We think it's really important to curate other people into the gallery and look for opportunities elsewhere to show our work. But this was a point at which, when I became a member there, I was showing a body of work that I'm still working on now called Lily Whitewash, which is basically, it's addressing this issue of these skin lightening bars that are so prevalent in most countries that are not the US. A lot of people from the US don't even know that this is an issue, but in India, in Asia, in Europe, really a whole lot on the continent of Africa, women are encouraged to lighten their skin with these bars that tend to have mercury in them, hydroquinone. They not only do physical damage to women, but they have been shown to really do like psychological damage to women. So I'm taking this thing, casting all these bars myself with charcoal, sometimes in resin, but taking something that I find as an object itself is already so beautiful, but then caging it in this lace, which I also hand make. So taking this very traditional technique that is considered part of one society and using it to trap visually something that is so beautiful but very different and contrasting from it. At the time that I was working at Independent Seaport Museum, because of my work with the kids there and because of my work at Please Touch Museum, I was asked to create this sort of space as part of this exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art of G's Bend quilts. Souls Grown Deep, which is a foundation that tries to infuse collections across the country with the work of Black artists, both craft-based but also outsider art, a whole bunch of different things. They had gifted the museum all of these quilts from G's Bend. And so I was asked to make something in response to the show, a space where families and visitors could come and sit and reflect about the show after they'd gone in and seen the work. So I came up with the idea of creating this quilted environment, but covering like this existing sort of outdoor igloo that would be really spacious, but also I could play off the patterning of these triangles in repetition around the dome itself. So using people from my own community, people I'd worked with at Fabric Workshop, but also elsewhere, we created 102 unique triangles to be sewn around the dome. A lot of people helped with the fabrication of these bricklayer and housetop repeated triangles. And then I cut all of them down and sewed the actual cover for the dome so that it could go over the top. And in addition to that, created some sort of foam covered areas that were also quilted that could go on the seats on the inside of the dome. And I called it Patterning Community because it really was about figuring out how to draft all of these pieces, put them together, but there's no way I could have done this on my own in the 2 months that it took to create it after it got approved. The PMA took its time telling me that it was going to happen, and then it was happening, and I was like, I still work a full-time job, so I guess, again, I'm not sleeping, but also I'm having people from my community help me. So part of that was also creating some programming to go along with it, these quilted sort of refrigerator magnets where kids could say, I'm seeing something that looks like this, and I get to make my own version, and there's not any rules, but I get to be a type of artist too. So that was really fun to create and fun to install in the Perlman Center. Another opportunity that I took to work with community-based programming was through mural arts, which are usually known for the murals that they paint around Philadelphia, but they also have a program called Entrepreneurs, in which the students will choose what they want to work on. They wanted to work on sewing. People that worked there knew that I worked mostly in, sewing and embroidery and all of these things. So I taught the kids pattern making, and I taught them how to make their own accessories, mostly bags, but also some other things. But each student got to individually say to me, hey, this is the type of bag I want to make. I want to make a duffel bag. And again, just like with that flat filled full project, I had them start small. We learned seaming, so they all learned all different types of seams. And then we thought about how to take this thing that you are thinking about, that you're drawing, taking it from flat pattern and thinking about it dimensionally. So if it's a duffel bag, what are the shapes that you need to have to create that? If it's going to be a bucket bag, how large is it going to be? How many pieces do you need, including your straps? Just asking those questions and have them talk aloud about it, have them help each other, again, co-teaching, and then getting used to working on the sewing machines and making a muslin and then making a final one. The unfortunate thing about this program is that the last few weeks of it took place during the beginning of COVID, so I didn't even get to finish the projects with them, but I did get to see some of the things that they finished working on, which was great. But again, just showing what is possible, because a lot of them said that they didn't even think that they'd ever be able to use a sewing machine, and then suddenly they're making these dimensional objects, so another great opportunity. Here I'm thinking about, again, culture. I was also asked to make a project for that print shop, Second State, that was trying to highlight the new screen printing sort of setup they had, but I didn't want to work in screen printing. I wanted to create an edition of shirts. So referencing being at a print studio, but also making it my own version. So I created an edition of these shirts, all the same size, all with the same Nija gal, which Nija and like number 9 JA is shorthand for Nigeria, and how a lot of people either from Nigeria or that are in America that are just using it shorthand mostly for texting will refer to themselves. And it just says Nija gal and repeat. It also says it on the etched wooden hangers and acrylic hangers that go along with them. But I was thinking about how I usually work and how to sort of marry two different areas that I've been in. Before it was those embossed nets, but now it's taking garments, which my background is in, and creating something that I'm calling an edition that wouldn't usually be considered an edition. Usually it would be a capsule or a line, but just trying to play sort of with the setting that is requesting the work of me and how I like to work. So coming back to the pandemic, because that happened and because I felt like I needed to be closer to family, I decided to transition into public school teaching, which is something I said I would never do because of things. But I did it because it was important to me to be close to family. So even though I had projects that were still pending, including having shows in different parts of the country, I moved back to Texas and was getting certified to teach while teaching my first year, which was also hybrid teaching because of COVID. So I was teaching kids online at the same time that I was teaching them in the classroom, and also trying to figure out how I could make the experience for the kids at home the same for the kids in the classroom. That included creating kits, painting kits, colored pencil kits, weaving kits. It was really important to me because of the area that I was in. It was Lake Worth. The school district was very socioeconomically disadvantaged, and I was trying to make the experiences the same for the kids at home because I knew that on top of everything, it was just rough. You were not getting to be with your peers. who knows what's going on at home, but at least for 1 hour of the day, you can have a very creative experience, and it doesn't have to be too different from what your classmates are getting to do. So we tried again to, represent all sorts of different backgrounds in the classroom. We made ofrendas for Dia de los Muertos. We made calaveras, skulls for the younger kids. We had weaving. We talked about different artists. We had conversations lightly and before things started to get very crazy about race. This included bringing in examples of work from Amy Sherald, which naturally got the kids asking, well, why is she only painting Black people? And I said, well, historically, there has not been representation of people of different colors. And is it not important that you see people that look like you represented in many places? And then I just let them have the conversation from there. But in every sort of setting, I'm trying to make sure that students are seeing themselves reflected in the classroom as much as possible. These pictures are sort of back and forth. The two on the left-hand side are from my wedding. I got married in 2019 in Nigeria. And there's this welcoming ceremony for people coming to the wedding where you take a bowl of baby powder, and based on how far a distance they've come, you mark their hand or their face or their arm to show your appreciation of, like, you've come all this way to celebrate me. And then on the right-hand side, that was my mom's ceremony when my mom and dad got married. So in the more recent body of work that I had, I was really fascinated with the quilting aspect of that dome, and the PMA gifted it to me. So I wanted to use it again, but I wanted to really focus on thinking about, again, culture loss, or also what happens in the immigration process, especially in America, partially because of COVID, but also because it's very unorganized. It took 3 years for my husband to get here from Nigeria, and there was just a lot of confusion. There's lots of forms. There are not a lot of responses when you have questions to what is happening, about what the status of your application is. So I took some of the paperwork when I realized I didn't include a close-up, but the panels that are clear that look like windows are actually the paperwork that was involved for the application, overlaid with pictures from my wedding to my husband. And then taking, again, some of that Dutch wax cloth, cutting out some of the patterning and replacing it, sort of leaving holes in it with this sort of mesh material that I combined with it. During my second year of teaching, I was also working on a solo exhibition at the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, in which it was a combination of some of my older work that referenced sort of the cultural identity and all of that, memories of growing up here with parents that very clearly were not of this culture that I was reminded of all the time. For instance, starting driving school and calling a turn signal a trafficator, because that is what my parents called it, and being roundly embarrassed by my driving teacher saying, I don't know what word you're saying to me. So it really was funny and interesting to me to take all of these things that I was surrounded by that most people might not encounter in their life if they're not, a child of a Nigerian immigrant, and bring them into the show along with things that I'd been working on. Part of the show also included video that was played on loop of me interviewing my mom, my dad, and my uncle Abi, who is my cousin's dad, about their immigration experiences, all three of which were very different because my dad came ahead of my mom. And so his experience here was of being totally alone and not knowing anyone, and being a student in Oklahoma, and really having to get caught up. There were other Nigerian immigrants there, but he did not know them. And so he had a much more sort of lonely experience acclimating here. And then my mom joined him a couple of years later. And then my uncle came much later than that. But sort of asking them about this, asking what they experienced, asking what sort of advice they might have for my husband when he gets here, because as much as I could try to support him, I could never understand the experience of coming here as an adult, and he came even later in life than they did. It was important to me to ask those questions and also to be able to share it, because Houston is an area that is widely and largely populated by Nigerian immigrants. And the original iteration of the show was me interviewing them, and then COVID happened. So I had to change the tone of the show, and I had to change how I was sort of sharing those experiences by really just digging into my own personal family experiences, because I could not go into other people's homes and ask them to share, items and objects with me or their stories, because it was not safe at the time. And so here is another shot of the show, and then my mom and my niece also watching the video from the show. And that is the last slide. It kind of just came to an end naturally, but yeah, thank you so much for coming and listening and sitting, and if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them, or even just have conversation. Thank you. Yes. In my studio right now, I'm trying to create a studio because because I have basically moved back to Philadelphia. Oh yes, I didn't even talk about the job I'm actually doing now. I work at Tuft the World, which is a company that sells rug tufting supplies but also runs workshops. So I run their workshops for them. We are also expanding into doing non-tufting classes. But because that's the case, and because I'm trying basically to create an art center and summer camps and stuff where there are none, my studio practice is not happening right now. And part of trying to get that going again is that I'm actually going to be leaving Fjord. I'm curating my last show there to end at the end of April, and then I will be stepping away from that so I can get back into my studio practice a lot more. Sort of a new path I see for my practice is really involving more of what I was doing with the entrepreneurs, which is that I've been writing grant proposals to get equipment so that I can teach kids how to sew. And then as part of the program, if they complete it, they get to keep their sewing machines, they get to keep their cutting boards, they get to keep the rotary cutters, everything that we use so that they can learn how to sew, they are gifted, so that it's not just that you're doing this one-off thing and then you don't have access to it anymore. It's great to be able to teach people things, but to me, access is the most important. Every student that I talked to today, that I was talking to, I have been encouraging them, you need to figure out what community is going to support you after school. Your fees pay for the facilities, pay for the equipment now, but if you start this process of figuring out who you are in the studio and getting to a place where you're really comfortable, and you're not considering how you're going to continue using that afterwards, your practice comes to a stop. And then what happens? Like, maybe you end up doing a residency, that's an option, but maybe you haven't considered it, and then you lose momentum, and then you lose yourself. So that's something I wish that someone had said to me when I was leaving, is consider, and I told my Tyler students the same thing. It's great that you have access to this now for the 2 or 3 years that you're here. You need to start planning either by slowly acquiring used items, or if you can get them new, so that you can build out a space for you to work, or you need to find a co-working space or a maker space. But you need to consider those things now, because you don't think about it until you don't have access to it anymore. So, like I was saying, an iteration of what I hope my studio practice continues to be is not only teaching students, but empowering them to keep working after they have left my studio or I have left where they're working out of, so that they can continue being productive. So, long answer to what I'm doing now. Any other questions? Yes. I actually worked with the founders, one of the founders at the Fabric Workshop and Museum. I took his job over when he left, so I became one of the print technicians when he was leaving. And we just kept in contact. I did some contract sewing for him when he had another business that was about making bags that he was selling in museums. So it was really just keeping in touch with people, having those good working experiences with them, and them saying, I think that you would be right for this. Conversations that we had included me saying, I want to be teaching in an educational space that is not traditional. The public school teaching for me was the odd thing out, and it was out of necessity. I knew that I could take the certification courses and pass them, and I knew that I liked working with young kids and that I could be good at it. So I did that for what I needed to do to be close to home. But for me, I've always wanted to work in non-traditional educational spaces, and he knew that. So when they started their company 4 years ago, he asked me to do it. He's like, I can't pay you anything. And I was like, I can't afford that right now. And so when I started to think about, am I going to teach a 3rd year in public school? I don't want to do that. We connected again, and I said, I'm ready to move back. And if you are still interested in having this educational space, then I'm interested in helping you realize that dream. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, if not, thank you again for coming. It was really great to be able to share all this with you.
Great,
Thank you. Thank you.